All right. Good evening, folks. Phil Gallagher of Thraben University here for a Legacy set review. We got all of Theros Beyond Death, and we didn't get any bannings today, so now we can make informed decisions about where the format is going. I'm gonna, in before Oko turns the modern ban and restriction list into an elk. Yeah, so modern got a little bit of power level nerf today, and Legacy gets to continue to be the degenerate thing that it is that everyone knows and loves. Minus maybe Oko. I don't think most people love Oko right now. Yeah, I know. I'm back. I got a absolutely terrible sinus infection. I'm going on my third week of being sick. And last week I was just down. Like I went to the doctor, got like a steroid shot, antibiotics, the good cough medicine, all that jazz. And I'm mostly back to normal now, but you'll still probably hear me coughing and sniffling for the next week. As so. All right. Relative to the last couple of sets, I think the power level of this set is much lower. We're still going to see some things that are worthy of discussion, and we're going to see some things that are going to be like fringe playable in certain decks, but I don't think there is a single card in this deck that is of the power level of the things that we've been seeing in the last few sets. I don't think there's a Karn Great Creator, Oko, or Dreadhorde Arcanist in here. We have one card that has the potential to spawn a new archetype, and then other than that, I think we just have a bunch of things that yeah, maybe you could play one of those. This is a sideboard option. I think there's a lot of that in this set. And yes, I am happy to see it. I'm happy to see that we're not getting just a huge shakeup. I was getting a little bit tired of new set Legacy has completely changed around it. 2019 was brutal in terms of power level. There's still some great cards in this set. Don't get me wrong, but I think many of them are going to be great for their standard environments and not the best things ever printed. I think that Elspeth's way better than it looks, but we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so how it's going to work is I'm going to work my way from the least playable or unplayable cards in the set that are still worthy of discussion all the way down to the best stuff. And we're going to start with Eidolon, or Eidolon by proper pronunciation, of Obstruction. It has a Thalia-sized body and cost, and that might get you excited, but then you look at its ability. Loyalty abilities of Planeswalkers your opponents control cost 1 more to activate. So there are 2 positives to this card. Positive 1 is that your opponent does not get to activate the Planeswalker the turn that they play it if they are curving out. Positive 2 is that this is not legendary, so you can stack them. However, if we compare this to other cards that White already has access to, this doesn't quite cut it by Legacy standards. We have Suppression Field, which is a much better Hoser card, and then at 2 mana, we also have things like Sorcerous Spyglass, Phyrexian Revoker, and at 1 mana, we also have Pithing Needle. So I don't think this is actually bringing anything new to the table. A lot of people were thinking, hey, this can slot into Death and Taxes, right? Sure. If you want to play another creature that dies to all of the things that kill your X1s. There's plenty of Plague Engineer, Dread of Night, Dark Blast, sort of things running around the formats that kill X1s. I don't usually get super excited about putting another X1 creature into my deck. This is a case. Yeah, Basic Swamp. I played against a Delver deck for one of the daily D&T matches this week, where they played both of those cards, and I think a Null Rod too. And it's just come on, please, I have a family. Okay, yeah, that was the Monday episode. That was brutal. I think all I said all episode was just oh, that's bad for me. Oh, that's bad for me. Oh, that's worse for me. And the other problem with this card is that I don't think it's good enough to play in the main deck, and I don't think it's strong enough to be a sideboard card. So ultimately, even though I love the design of this card, I think this is made safe for a standard environment, not being made so that it's good for an older format like Legacy, Modern, or Vintage. So this is a card that I love, 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 love the design of, but it's not quite there in terms of power level. Alright, next up is Taranika, a Crowan veteran. A lot of people have messaged me asking if you can play this in the Mirren Crusader slot. Sure, you could. So, essentially, it turns a creature that normally couldn't attack and lets it attack. In this deck, that probably means that the creature is getting about +2 power. But there's a major problem with this card right now. The problem with this card is that it is a 3/3. And what is the most, maybe, dominant board control card in Legacy right now? Oko. This trades with one of your opponent's elks. If you have an elk, it turns that elk into a slightly bigger elk. An indestructible elk at that, but still an elk. So this can do some cool things in that, like, it can let your moms or Phyrexian Revokers attack. You know, it can, like, make your Thalia bigger or something like that. But what matchup do you really want this for? Most of the cards that are in the flex slots of D&T are cripplingly good in some matchup. Sanctum Prelate will just win a combo matchup. You know, Mirren Crusader is borderline unkillable against some of the decks running around the format. Cards like Palace Jailer will take over games. And some of the fringer stuff like Charming Prince, you know, sets you up for some major blowouts. Having a Walking Ballista in your main deck can deal with major things. What is this doing? Maybe allowing you to attack for 7 the following turn? I don't see why you want this card right now. The most interesting thing about it is that it's a legendary creature with vigilance. That's kind of cool. I think this card is probably going to be very good in other formats. You know, in a standard or something where you curve, the Eidolon into this, like, cool. It's a big body. It's a lot of aggro damage. But I don't really think this fits into the control role that D&T is trying to play. So as of right now, this is on the wrong side of playability too. And unfortunately, that's more or less it as far as like D&T creatures in this set go. There's another white creature that's interesting, but we'll get to that in a little while. There's one other card that I think falls into the unplayable territory, but I want to mention, and that's Klothys, God of Destiny. A lot of times, these green and one other off-color card find their way into some deck. So, a lot of those decks can't actually get to 7 Devotion to green/red, though, so I don't think you're actually turning this into your creature. So, this essentially ends up being a recurring graveyard hate card that gives you mana or life and damage. So this card does like a weird kind of Deathrite shaman-y impression at 3 times as much mana. I've seen some people going like, well, you could make this a Green Sun target for the Reanimator matchups. Have you heard of Scavenging Ooze, friend? I think this card is overcosted. It's interesting. It's cool. It swings life totals by a decent amount as far as something that's just gonna like sit on the board and give you value every turn. But right now in Legacy, if you're playing something that's green at 3 mana, is it better than Oko? Is it even close to Oko? Does it deal with Oko? The answer to all 3 of those things is no. Like, what are you doing with your mana? There have been a lot of really good 3 mana cards printed in the last 2 years. Narset, Oko, Teferi, Mentor. Mentor's a little older than that now, but you get the idea. There's a lot of very powerful things at 2 or 3 mana right now, and I don't think this hits the cut. So that's my unplayable category, and along with that is probably everything else that's not on this list, but those ones were close enough that I wanted to talk about them. I understood to be closer to Sulfuric Vortex that can sometimes boost your curve. Ace Trainer, that's a really good way to put it. So, like, what deck would want it for, like, the specifically Sulfuric Vortex side, though, you know? This probably isn't good enough that, like, you want to be splashing green in Burn. And, you know, when's the last time you saw someone playing, you know, a green-red Zoo-ish deck? There was one list this week that I think was a 5-color Tribal Flame Zoo. But otherwise, I haven't seen anything of that nature in quite a long time, you know? Think about how infrequently you see something like Destructive Revelry hitting play. And other than that, you know, what green-red decks do we have in Legacy? You know, Rogue Delver? You want to spend 3 mana on this, or 3 mana on a True Name Nemesis? You know, 3 mana on the backside of your Brazen Borrower. 3 mana on your Oko. I'm going to try to stop saying Oko, but it's really hard given where the format's at right now. Alright, Elspeth Sun's Nemesis. So, if you compare this to other Planeswalkers in the format, this is not up to snuff. This is just not a good Planeswalker. On the surface. However, I think the escape mechanic is very good. So, rather than think of this as something that poops soldiers once, think of casting this card 2 or 3 times, rather than once. -2, -2, -1. Recast. And then some combination of those 3 effects again. This is the sort of card where I could totally see this seeing play in something like, what is it? Is it Dega? That's red, white, black? No, Mardu. Mardu, there we go. In a Mardu deck, or as a Mirror Breaker in some sort of like blue-white style deck like Miracles. When the game drags on and on and on, I think the escape mechanic is very powerful. When I first read this card, I thought this was unplayable garbage. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know, if you're not really using your graveyard, how many times can you actually cast this in a game? If it's only exiling 4 cards from your graveyard, you can cast this a ton of times. So I think this card is probably better than it looks. I won't be surprised when I see this in play across the other side of the battlefield. I think the rate is definitely below average the first time that you cast it. But if you get this a second time, I think it starts to look pretty good. Yeah, Hellclan, I am alive. I had a real rough 2 weeks. I'm on week 3 of being sick. Oh, skepticism. That's a good point. So, that Elspeth is not a card for Death and Taxes. Death and Taxes does not put cards into its graveyard on its own. This is the sort of thing where you need to be playing a lot of cards that go to the graveyard. So your blue decks that are producing cantrips, your, you know, say you're playing like a Faithless Looting Mardu deck. You know, you're playing things like Lingering Souls, Faithless Looting, Young Pyromancer that all have value together. Those are the sorts of shells where I can see this having a home. With Death and Taxes, you know, if it's turn 9, how many cards do I actually have in my graveyard? Will I have 4 cards in my graveyard at that point? It depends on how many of my cards my opponent is answering. The only card that I play that goes directly to the graveyard in the main deck is Swords to Plowshares. So this is Elspeth is very much not a card for Death and Taxes. Alright, next up, Purphoros Bronze-Blooded. Okay. This card looks bad. It's because it kind of is. but bear with me. Seething Song and the other rituals of that nature end up producing 5 mana, which is conveniently how much mana that this thing produces. So in the mono red sneak attack style decks, in the past as enablers, they've had Through the Breach, sneak attack, and then some other fringe things that you could play as well that cost a little bit more mana. This gives you one more option to play at 5 mana as an enabler. The downside of this card is that it costs 3 more mana to activate, so you're probably not activating it the turn that you play it in a lot of cases. But I would feel remiss in not mentioning this card in a review of the set, because I don't understand mono red sneak attack deck building at an intimate level. And this is another card that gives you a similar effect. And in a deck that has very little manipulation, maybe that's good enough. My gut says no, but I want to mention it. The other thing that it does is it does give your other creatures haste, so this is relevant. A problem with this card, though, in those shells, is a lot of times they're playing things like Worldspine Worm and Emrakul as things to sneak in, and this doesn't let you sneak in either of those. So this can put in your, like, Inferno Titans, your Blightsteel Colossus, your, Hellkites, whatever it is you want to try to cheat in, as long as it's red or an artifact. So it would require deck building changes. Again, I want to mention this card, but I don't think it's quite there. Alright, next up is a card that I really like, but I don't know where it fits. So, historically, Red Prison has run a couple of strange sweepers. So we've seen it running things like Pyroclasm, some of the Rolling Thunder type effects. It runs Fiery Confluence as a sweeper. This card is really interesting in that, by Legacy standards, outside of Oko, this should kill everything. It's pretty rare that 4 damage to a Planeswalker isn't going to kill that Planeswalker. What creature has more than 4 toughness that you're commonly going to see? Reality Smasher, Gurmag Angler. There's a few, but in Legacy, this should wipe the board for a lot of decks. Consider one of your Snow or Miracle decks right now. What are they going to have? Mentors, maybe some Elks, Icefang Coatls, Snapcasters, a Jace, which has probably brainstormed or unsummoned something, a Teferi or a Narset. This will kill a lot of stuff. Now, right now, I don't think this card is particularly playable because it doesn't kill Oko. And that's huge. Oko's, the best Planeswalker in the format right now. And so this card isn't really playable. But in the future, assuming that Oko gets itself banned at some point, which wouldn't surprise me given how aggressive Wizards has gotten with bannings recently and how pushed some of the cards have been, it wouldn't surprise me if we come to see a day where some control deck starts playing this. I mentioned Red Prison earlier just because it's the sort of deck that might want a card like this. That shell is awkward for this card because they're playing Planeswalkers of their own. But at some point, we may see a deck that doesn't really rely on creatures or Planeswalkers, and it will just use this to just destroy everything. The first 3 dominoes have fallen for Oko. Legacy is the next format. That's very possible, and we may end up seeing Vintage as the Bastion where Oko is allowed. I think Oko is obnoxious. I'm still enjoying games of Legacy. I'm not super jazzed about playing Legacy all the time because of it. But, you know, the format's adjusted a bit. It's still just really, really, really stupid and good. Alright. Next up is Dryad of the Elysian Grove. This card's cool. So, historically, cards like this have seen fringe play in Legacy. Oracle of Moldiah and Courser of Kruphix both occasionally see play in various sorts of decks. So this lets you dump an extra land into play while also giving your lands every basic land type. So this is, you know, essentially kind of a ramp card and kind of a fixing card. No, this doesn't look like a Nick Fit card to me. This looks like it dies to a Pernicious Deed. I had more in mind something like, you know, a 3-color Green Sun deck where you put this in as a 1-of to go and fetch. You know, where it gives you fixing in case you have some double mana cards. It also lets you dump out, you know, some cards from your hand. Say you're playing something like a Tireless Tracker. This plays really well with it. This card also can combo with Scape Shift, but trying to Scape Shift in Legacy is risky at best. I believe this is going to work the same way as Urborg does. Hey, Jerry, thank you very much for your support. Yeah, I had a rough couple of weeks. What's the phrasing of Urborg? Let me double check. So Urborg is in each land is a swamp in addition to its other type. So Blood Moon beats Urborg. This might be the same layer as Blood Moon. No, this is another in addition. So I think Blood Moon beats this. Not 100%. Oh, Urborg being a land is what complicates it there. I see. Yeah, I'm not gonna answer that question then. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. I haven't done layers in a little while, and the Blood Moon, Urborg, and similar things are always a little bit confusing. It might be timestamps. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is also green, and it's the one that's right next to it here, the first Eroan games. So the first turn, you play it, you get a sold. Sure, a 1/1. The second turn, you put 3 1/1 counters on a creature you control. Like, let's assume you just, like, play this out first. So you play this, the next turn, it attacks for 4. The next turn, you draw 2 cards. The next turn, you get a gold token, which I think you can sacrifice for a mana. Yeah, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any mana, add 1 color to your mana card. Blah, 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 blah. So, this card is super interesting in that if your opponent does not interact with this at all, this is a stupid amount of value. This is 3 mana, create a 4/4, draw 2 cards, and get 1 of your mana back out of it over the course of 3 turns. Or I guess 4 turns. And that is crazy. However, let's say you play this on turn 1 or 2, and then your opponent goes, Lightning Bolt, you're idiot, and you don't have another creature. You then miss out on this, you miss out on this, and you refund 1 of your mana. So this is a card where if everything goes right for you and your opponent isn't interacting on an axis that messes with this, this is one of the best legacy rate cards you could hope for. You know, 3 mana 4/4 that draws you 2 cards and then creates some mana later. And, you know, if you can end up, like, blinking or reusing this enchantment in some way, like, cool. The question is, does this end up being better than other green and 2 colorless things that you can play? And the first 2 comparisons that I can think of are Tireless Tracker and Managorger Hydra. Managorger Hydra is a much safer threat that can get big quickly, and Tireless Tracker is probably a safer course of card advantage over time. So this is a card where if this works, it's incredibly good. So I'm thinking about this in some sort of Ancient Tomb City of Traders deck, where you're going and playing this on turn 1 or turn 2 before your opponent has time to, like, go and set it up. Like, consider this a turn 2 play, like, turn 1 Chalice off Ancient Tomb, turn 2 First Erroan games. That's a pretty powerful opening by Legacy standards. You know, you attack for 4, then you draw 2 cards, and you never want the prison decks to be drawing more cards. The thing is, if you don't make it to stage 3 without anything going wrong with this card, I don't know that this is actually good. Now, if you have multiple creatures and you're playing this in the mid-game, this card becomes a bit better. You know, say you play this on about turn 3, you already have, like, a Tireless Tracker, you already have a Managorger Hydra, you know, you have a Thrawn, you know, some other big derpy green idiot. Then, if you're more guaranteed to get value off of this card, I can see it. This is a card that I personally will probably try out in a deck or 2, but I'm a bit skeptical. No, Bailey, I won't be watching the game tonight. I have this to do. Then I'm going to play some Hades, because that game is really, really cool. Alright, next up, Haktos. The guy who's definitely not named Achilles. This card is really cool. I love, love, love the design of this card. So when it enters the battlefield, you choose 2, 3, or 4 at random. And this card has protection from every other converted mana cost, other than the one that you choose at random. For Legacy, this means that it always has protection from 1. So no Lightning Bolt, no Fatal Push, no Swords of Plowshares, no Path to Exile. This is an well, maybe correctly costed True Name Nemesis-like effect, but the mana cost is super awkward. If you think about it, how many Legacy decks right now can make white, white, red, red consistently? Yeah, that's the biggest problem with this card right now, is its mana cost is super intensive. But oh boy, if you get this thing into play, it is pretty darn hard to answer. I can see this slotting into some Legacy decks. Like, if you're playing a deck like Humans that already has a bunch of tutors and can put this onto the battlefield off the mana that it can make, or off an Ether Vial, it's pretty good. Alright, so hear me out. We're playing Miracles, and we have 2 Astrolabes, right? Yeah, so for Legacy standards right now, I think one thing that does hold this back is Plague Engineer. If you're playing this card, you're probably playing it in a human deck of one nature or another. You know, like you're trying it in Red Splash D&T, you know, you're trying it in actual humans. And so it being an X1 is a little bit of a liability in that regard. But your Recruiter of the Guard is able to find this. Not Imperial Recruiter, though. Recruiter of the Guard. Yeah, 2/3 of the time, you're not going to be blocked by Elks, either. So this thing is going to be very, very good. In addition to just always having protection from 1, it's going to have protection from a lot of other stuff, too. So, you know, like, if you have protection from 2, you know, something like Assassin's Trophy or a Dreadbore isn't going to get it. If you have a, from 3, then it stops, a bunch of the planeswalkers, Lily Last Hope, Teferi, things of that nature. If you have protection from 4, Jace isn't going to bounce it. Another downside is that, like, it is attacking every single combat. So, like, if you get a little unlucky about which one you name, say you name 2 against Death and Taxes, and you have to attack into Athalia, you're a little bit sad about it. Yeah, sure. It also dies to Dread of Night if that's a card that's popular. But super, super interesting design. Wouldn't be surprised to see someone try it out, but again, I think it has problems. Alright. Kroxa. So, when this thing enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escaped. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card, and then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card loses 3 life. So, playing this as a 2-mana, your opponent discards a card of their choice and maybe loses 3 life, is unplayable by Legacy standards. That is not an acceptable level of power for Legacy. The escape side, however, is pretty insane. So let's say that you discard this thing to Faithless Looting. And you go, and then you get to 4 mana, and you play this. So you get a 4 mana 6/6. Cool, but not exciting. It enters the battlefield. Your opponent discards a card. Maybe loses a life. Sorry, maybe loses 3 life. And then every time it attacks, you repeat that. That starts to get interesting. I think the front side of it being so bad means that it really isn't going to see Legacy play. But there's a lot of value-oriented graveyard decks in Legacy right now, such as, something like Hogak. So it would not surprise me to see a deck that self-mills itself a lot playing one of these. It has some problems. I think being a legendary creature is super awkward with this card, in that, like, you cheated in from the graveyard, your opponent plays Caracas and undoes your work, and that feels pretty bad. Could you sideboard this in TES? Sure. I guess. Like, the rate's good, but are you going to be, like, discarding that card, or are you just willing to, like, 2-turn this sucker and just, like, on turn 3, use a ritual or something and play that? Like, I don't know. TES feels really good and really streamlined right now, so I don't think you want something like this in there. But, the stats on this are, like, right at that point where I'm like, it's close. And so I think that's kind of with a lot of the things in this category. It wouldn't surprise me to see someone brewing and trying to get a little graveyard-oriented value out of this card. A lot of the cards that have graveyard value have seen play. Your things like Faithless Looting, Lingering Souls that get flashback. There's value in redeploying those cards again and again and again. Land LED activate turn 0, this guy. It doesn't quite work, right? Because LED makes mana of 1 color. So you would need, like, a Lotus Petal, too. Land Lotus Petal, LED, turn 1 Kroxa, go. What could possibly go wrong? But that is an interesting point. Now we have a Best Doggo. I love this card. So this word is keyword soup. Vigilance, Menace, Lifelink. Creature cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards. This is a great Magic card. Like, really, there is a lot going on here. That was exactly the comparison that I was about to make. Questing Beast is 1 more mana, but just, like, has that, like, same density of text that this card does. However, I think the thing holding this card back is that it is 3 mana. I think that if you are playing a junk deck, and you can turn this into a turn 2 play, this is pretty good. You know, if you go, like, turn 1 Noble Hierarch or Bird, turn 2 this, that does a ton of damage against graveyard decks. So, specifically, I had in mind Hogak decks, where sometimes Hogak is really good at, like, messing around with the graveyard hate that you're playing. So, like, you can go and muck with, like, their recasting of Gravecrawlers, their Vengevines. Like, this does so much. About the only thing that they can still do that involves their graveyard is cast a Hogak from their hand. And that's still very good, but this stops just about everything else that the Hogak deck is doing. You know, it doesn't stop Bridge from Belows, but it does a lot for graveyard-oriented decks. Its stats mean that it helps to stabilize the game, and the Menace and Vigilance are a pretty mean combo against a lot of decks. If your opponent has only one, like, attacker/blocker, you attack in for 3, and they can't attack back. So this card has great stats and a wonderful relevant ability, but if you're only in black and white, I don't think you can play this card. I think you have to be in green to potentially play this card on turn 2 in order for this to be good enough. The way Legacy Graveyard Hate works right now, it really needs to be fast. So I want my Graveyard Hate to either come down potentially before the game starts in, like, Surgical or Leyline, or I want it available to me on turn 1 most of the time. Usually, in fact, in, like, Tormod's Crypt, where it is, you know, a 0-cost thing, so I can still be doing other stuff. So this in any green deck is just too slow as a piece of hate. It's a great supplemental creature, though. Alright, speaking of cards with a lot of texts. So, Polukranos is a 4-mana 6/6 that you can use to fight some stuff, and it's slowly going to lose some counters over time. When you finally kill it, you can bring it back as a 12/12. So it's a 4-mana 6/6, followed by a 6-mana 12/12. Potentially, again, followed by a 6-mana 12/12. This is the sort of card where it is probably a playable one-of in a Green Sun deck. Now, here's the thing about Green-Black X decks, though. They have so many choices for what creatures they want to play in those flex slots that I'm not sure that this one makes the cut. If your Green-Black X deck is not using the graveyard in basically any way, this is potentially quite strong in that it's a one-of that gives you inevitability. You know, if your opponent has, like, counter spells or kill-based or sacrifice-based removal, this thing coming back, like, again and again and again is probably pretty good. So I would not be surprised to see this seeing play as a one-of in some sort of, like, Nick Fit, Maverick, Rock style deck. I don't know that this card is insane by Legacy standards, but this is probably obnoxious elsewhere. Yeah, so at the 4-mana slot, you have things like Master of the Wild Hunt, Questing Beast, Thrun, lots of other options. And even at, like, 3 mana, you have things like Tireless Tracker that are just really good. Courser Crufrix that gives you good utility. This creature is the right sort of power level. Does it actually fit into a deck? That's another question. So all of those cards that I just went over were in the fringe category. That is, I wouldn't be surprised to see someone trying it out or messing with it. But all in all of the cards that I just talked about have some problem. You know, it's underpowered. it's slightly overcosted. It doesn't fit right now. There's other options, you know, the card's bad if there's removal involved, 2 mana intensive and dies to some problematic things. Front half's bad, too much mana, doesn't fit anywhere. The things in the next category up, I believe, actually will see some degree of play. And that is, they're probably going to be good or at least playable in the right sort of decks. Oh god, yeah, I can't imagine playing limited against this thing. Like, alright, it's a 4-mana 6/6. That's already good. It can fight my best creature, then, like, trade with some smaller body, then come back as a 12/12. Like, you can do a lot with that. Alright. So the first card is Heliod Suncrowned. So, as a 3-mana 5/5 sometimes, that is not good. So, this just as an enchantment that, like, when you gain life, make a creature bigger, that doesn't do it. This enchantment giving your creatures lifelink, that doesn't do it. This card on its own is trash. It is just, like, not playable. Just even consider something like Death and Taxes. Assuming you have Heliod in play, how often do you actually have 4 other white symbols in play? Many of your permanents are colorless. Your vials, your evokers, your pieces of equipment. And a lot of times your creatures are trading off, they're getting killed. If you have 4 devotion worth of other stuff in play already successfully, you're probably doing fine. You don't need this. So really, the only time you want to be playing this is if you can do an infinite combo with it via Walking Ballista. So the only place in Legacy where that fits in right now, as far as an established deck, is Bomberman. Bomberman already wants to play an infinite combo with Walking Ballista. It plays 3 of them in the main deck and a 4th in the sideboard to fetch via Karn. I would not be surprised to see a Heliod in the sideboard, or sorry, not in the sideboard, maybe even in the main deck, to just, like, have one more card that lets you combo off with Ballista. Notably, Heliod and Ballista is a 2-card combo, whereas many of Bomberman's combos require more than 2 cards. So you want to be playing this in a deck that has fast mana in it, and Bomberman already has that. So you want to be able to goldfish at least somewhat quickly with this card. So, you know, your turn 1, like, Ancient Tomb, Chalice the Void, turn 2 Heliod, turn 3 Ballista kill, is totally, totally reasonable. Yeah, and that's the reason why Bomberman might like this. So currently, Bomberman to, like, infinite combo off requires its graveyard, and Heliod plus Walking Ballista lets you combo off without using your graveyard. I believe mentors don't. The mentor tokens do not have white symbols in their converted mana cost. They don't have a converted mana cost. They're CMC 0. Not to be confused with something like Pack Rat from a while back, which was making tokens that were copies of itself. So I believe that did add to devotion. Yeah, and similarly, in Bomberman, which is mostly a colorless deck, you are not turning on devotion for this thing. So, cool. I gave my Salvager's lifelink and gained 2 life. You know, that's not good. Yeah, so Heliod's devotion thing is actually a strength in some ways. Bill brings up a good point. That when this is not a creature, you can't just bounce it with Caracas, because it's just a legendary enchantment. So that is something that's actually going for it. No, you'd be afraid of your opponent bouncing your 3-mana enchantment that you invested into. Yeah, this is a combo kill card, nothing else, at least in the context that we've seen it. It would not surprise me to see someone try to specifically make a Walking Ballista oriented combo deck, and, like, maybe there's other Walking Ballista type cards that you can combo off with and kill with it. Walking Ballista is certainly the best one, but, you know, your Triskelion things should work for that as well. So, you know, maybe there's other ways you can go about building a Bomberman style deck that, you know, can use the graveyard sometimes but doesn't have to. And that's cool. So one of the cool things about playing this in like a Bomberman style shell is that, like, say you have like your walking ballista and like an LED, you can like discard your hand if you already have everything that you need on board and just like use the LED to like activate the lifelink ability and go off. So that's neat. It's a little more all in than I might like, but this is going to be a good power level combo in, you know, at least Pioneer, probably Modern, and Legacy. It's probably at the lower end of the power level as far as degenerate combo decks go, but I think it still counts. All right, next up is the hot take card of the set. Yes. So one more last thing on Heliod. Heliod is not a standalone card. Heliod is not a playable legacy card on its own. Like, period, end of statement. It is a combo card. Like, you have to combo with it or the card does borderline nothing. And that's what makes it worse than the other cards that, like, Bomberman is playing. So, like, Mystic Forge, Mentor, and Salvagers are all fine cards on their own that can all do things when it's not just part of going off. And that's what Heliod is not. All right, next up is the hot take card of the set, Cling to Dust. Some people, most notably Max of Min Max blog, think that this card is the Nutter Butters. So it is a recursive graveyard hate card, that can either gain you life or draw you cards. And it has escape, so you can repeat it. Max was comparing this card to Deathrite Shaman. It has some similar abilities to that, and you can reuse it. But I don't particularly think this card is good. Like, I don't know that I like this card better than something like Surgical Extraction as a piece of graveyard hate. You know, this is graveyard hate for a fair matchup, where, like, hey, I need to pick this out of your graveyard, and I'm going to draw a card. Oh, and 2 or 3 turns have gone by. I don't have anything to do with my mana this turn. I'm going to pick another thing out of your graveyard and draw a card. I don't think the cost of 4 mana and 5 cards from my graveyard is low enough that I want this card to be in my deck for value over time. So as far as other graveyard hate cards go that, like, replace themselves or better, we already have Relic of Progenitus, which is, in my opinion, kind of an unplayable legacy card. And we have Nihil Spellbomb, which, like, if you have some artifact-based synergies, you know, something like Metalcraft or something like Emery that will let you play it again, I like that. But otherwise, like, I don't love that sort of thing. And I think we got a better graveyard hate card in the set as well, honestly. Yeah. So I think if you are playing a slow, grindy deck that, like, needs a little bit of value while also wanting one more graveyard hate card, like, I can see it. But I don't think this card's particularly good. So many black decks already take advantage of their graveyard in some other way. Like, if you take a look at Grixis Delver, like, historically they're playing something like Gurmag Angler, Grim Lavamancer, Bedlam Reveler, that already, like, does ancillary things with their graveyard. I don't know if you need to be taxing your graveyard with this card. There are some people praising this card up to high heaven. So this is one of those ones where I'm beyond skeptical that this card is anything above playable. Like, I don't particularly think this is a good card. I think it will see play. It's a neat effect. The ability to, like, draw some extra card end games is something. But I don't really see this card being main deckable at all. And that's kind of where I'm at with that. I'm willing to be wrong, and I'll eat crow if I'm wrong. I will totally own up to the fact that I think this card is trash. But I don't see the same thing that the proponents of this card see. All right, the next card is very comparable to Bedlam Reveler. I mean, Dark I obviously put it in my playable category, right? So, like, while I'm calling the card trash, that's slight hyperbole. You know, I think the card is a sideboard option for decks, but I don't think it's particularly exciting. So this Ox is cool. So when it enters the battlefield, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. So presumably, if you're playing this thing, it's for one of 2 reasons. Number 1 is you intend on already being hellbent, and you just want to treat this as an ancestral recall when it enters the battlefield. So the other way to play this card is that you're putting it into your graveyard via something like Faithful Looting, Careful Study, or Dredge, and then you're using it to re-dredge afterwards. So the body on this isn't necessarily impressive. If you're hard casting it, you're getting a 4/2 for 5 mana. Yeah, that's a little sad. If you're escaping, it's a 5/3 for 2 mana. Okay, that's a good rate. So here's the issue with this card, in my mind. Exiling 8 cards from your graveyard is a huge cost. So this is not something that is the card that lets you start going off. This is the card that lets you end the game once you've already started going off. So, like, consider your opening hand with Dredge. You start with 7 cards. Let's say you're on the play. You can make that, like, 9 cards if you have something like a Careful Study. Like, one of those things is going into your like, play zone, like the battlefield. Like, you're going to play out a land to do this, to do your setup card. So casting the Ox on something like turn 1 from the graveyard would basically require all of your resources. 8 cards from the graveyard is a ton. So instead, I think this is the sort of card where if you're playing it to extend your combo turn. So let's say instead that you're going off on turn 1, and you get like 2 dredges on turn 1, and then you hit this sucker. And then you, like, crack an LED and escape. You either win that turn effectively, or you actually win the game that turn. So I think this card's ceiling is incredibly high. And it gives you another thing to do with red mana off an LED. So a lot of times, dredge hands will start the game by going, land, Careful Study, or Breakthrough or something like that after playing a Lion's Eye Diamond, and you're hoping to crack that LED for red and do something from your graveyard. This gives you one more thing to do from your graveyard. The power level of this card is right. I'm not sure how much of a cost versus benefit this Ox gives you, though. I see this as, like, maybe a 1 or 2 of in a dredge deck that wants to try it out, but probably not more than that. Every copy of this that you put into your deck makes your opening hand kind of worse, but it makes your mid-game better. Or it makes it better once you start going off is maybe a better way to say that. And it's also not black, so you can't exile it to Icarid, so that's another thing to consider. Alright, next up, we get 3 Enchantress cards that are all potentially playable as, like, maybe sideboard cards. As the enchantment set, that's not really surprising. Alright. Destiny Spinner is really cool. So, I want you to imagine this. You're playing against Enchantress. Game 1, you go, oh, they only have these Shroudy idiots. So I'm going to board out my removal spells. And then they turn 2 play Destiny Spinner. And you go, oh my god, I literally can't counter any of the spells in their deck anymore. And I took out their removal, so I can't get rid of this. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. Here's the other thing with this card. That ability at the bottom, that doesn't tap this creature. So, you know how Enchantress sometimes in the mid game taps Sacrosanctum for like 12 mana? Well, you can just activate this ability a couple of times and kill your opponent with some lands. Like, when Enchantress gets going, they regularly have, 5 to 10 enchantments on the battlefield. So this card can just be like, oh, turn 2 of my lands into idiots, and you whoops get a kill out of nowhere, while also making it so none of your spells get countered. This card is really good. And it's also an enchantment, so all of your Enchantress effects still draw cards with this. So I don't know that this is a card you want to main deck, because when all of the lightning bolts, fatal pushes, swords to plowshares are still running around, this card loses a lot of value. So you could definitely main deck this. The power level is there. But I think this is one of those cards where you play it to juke your opponents. So when your opponent is playing, a blue deck, you just have a bunch of these that you can jam on turn 2, and they will be very, very strong. This is a card where if more decks played with enchantments, I would rate this card much higher than it's currently rated. I was super, super impressed by this card, and I was kind of surprised to see not very many people talking about it. That may be because, I've actually spent some time playing Enchantress, and, a lot of Legacy players don't have that luxury because they don't have Moto. I've actually played with Enchantress in paper as well. But this card is my sleeper pick for the set, without a doubt. Let's keep talking Enchantress. Because we got another sweet enchantment-based card. Uro is nowhere on this list. Uro's front end costs the same as Oko, and Oko is better than Uro, so that's where we're at there. Cetizen Champion is essentially Tireless Tracker for Enchantress. So, Tireless Tracker, awesome, awesome, awesome magic card. And Cetizen Champion fills that exact same role in a slightly different way. So, the difference here is that Tireless Tracker starts out as a 3/2, and Cetizen Champion starts out as a 1/3. Tireless Tracker is more likely to get value every single time, since as a game goes on, you're always going to be drawing lands. And this one is a little slower to spiral out of control. This gives you a lot more redundancy, if that's something you need out of your Enchantress deck, in that you get even more things that let you draw cards. But I'm not entirely sure that this one is where the deck wants to be. The power level is definitely correct. You know, anything that is letting the Enchantress, like, continue to draw cards every turn and have an alternate win condition, that's an okay place to be. But I don't know that this one is playable. So, like, I definitely think Destiny Spinner is way better than Cetessan Champion, for example. And you know what? You know what? I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and actually move this card up a row. I think that card's great. Yeah, and Lord Darkview brings up a good point. Cetessan Champion doesn't contribute to a lot of the other Enchantress effects, since it itself isn't an Enchantress, whereas Destiny Spinner is. And then we have one more Enchantress card. Calyx, Destiny's Hand. So it's plus, you look at the top 4, you get an enchantment and put it into your hand. It's -3, is you exile a creature or an enchantment until one of your enchantments leaves the battlefield of your choice. And then it's -7 is, what is it, refresh, whatever. It returns all your enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this card is something that Enchantress would like, in that if you have something like a Solitary Confinement or an Elephant Replenish, that's it, thank you. If you have something like an Elephant Grasp or a Solitary Confinement in play, this just constantly gives you gas every turn, while also allowing you to remove problematic permanents from the battlefield. The question I have is, how does the math work on this card, given that you have some things in your deck, like Green Sun Zenith, that are not actually hits for this card? I think the math works out so that this is pretty consistently going to hit, but it is not 100%. Another problem with Enchantress is that unless you have some of your prison pieces in play already, the loyalty card on this, the loyalty number on this is not necessarily high enough where you're going to 100% keep this card around for multiple turns. So, like, say your opponent has a creature that matters in a 1/1 token. You can exile the creature that matters, and then the 1/1 token kills this card because you don't actually have any blockers. So this card, like, not being an enchantment itself, means that it doesn't play nicely with some of the other effects. It is a little bit expensive. I'm not necessarily sure that this card is good enough, but if you get repeated uses out of this minus ability, that's very strong. Why doesn't this card just plus for its abilities like Oko? Great question. Yeah, why can't we have a 4-mana Planeswalker that just +3s and exiles a creature? That would be fine, right? Right? Guys? So, if you already have a lock established, this is pretty darn good. One of the ways that Enchantress loses games is by failing to continue to have something to do every turn, and Calyx's plus ability makes it so that you continue to, like, hit enchantments to draw. So, like, an easy way to lose with Enchantress is to have a partial lockout and then need to, like, keep drawing enchantments every turn to increase your mana count for Sanctum, or to make sure that you're, like, having cards to discard for Solitary Confinement or something like that. So The plus on this would really help with you hitting things. Yeah, and most decks can't remove enchantments. So the stuff that Enchantress sticks in plays, it stays there more or less forever. The Abrupt Decay decks are the notable exceptions to that. And like sometimes something like Count's Judgment can get rid of something. But usually, like, someone plays a Sylvan Library, like, that sucker's there all game. It's just how it works. So, people will try out Calyx in Enchantress. I don't know if it gets there, but the power level's definitely right. Whether or not, like, its loyalty works, we'll see. And then I have one last one that goes into the playable category. And that's Nylea's Intervention. So we're going to ignore the X damage twice to each creature with flying. Like, sure, you occasionally kill a Delver or something like that, but that's not why we're looking at this. It is just tutor for X lands. So my thought isn't to play fair with this card. My thought is to play unfair with this card. I recently 5-0'd with a green Cloud Post list. So, what if you go and just, on turn 4, you go and you cast this for X equals 4. Search for, like, Glimmer Post, Glimmer Post, Glimmer Post, Glimmer Post, Glimmer Post, if you're playing against some fair, stupid Delver deck. Ah, well, that's kind of cool. Or you go and you use this to just get, like, the cards that bury your opponent. You get 2 Cloud Boasts, you get an Eye of Ugin, and maybe you get, like, a Maze of Ith or a Glacial Chasm or something like that. Similarly, if you go and you play this in some sort of deck that has Exploration, Mana Bond, Elvish Rejuvenator, any one of the other green creatures that lets you play an extra land, this potentially lets you use all the extra mana you're getting to get even more mana and to get your utility lands out of it. This card is interesting. I don't know what this does, but this is a really powerful effect. We don't usually get the ability to tutor for X different cards, and that's really unique. So, like, let's say hypothetically you play one of these in lands, and you played your Exploration on turn 1. Turn 2, you have 4 lands in play. You cast this for X equals 2. You get Dark Depth Stage, and you have just found both of your pieces of the combo, and you can combo off on turn 3. I don't think that sort of thing is all that unlikely. Is this necessarily better than, like, a Gamble or something like that? Yeah, you start to get into some tricky territory, and, like, this is green-green, so that's slightly awkward for the Cloud Post decks, while also slightly being awkward for some of the lands decks as well, in that, like, sometimes they're only starting on a single green source due to a Mox Diamond or something like that. But power level is definitely right. All right, I've run out of water, so I will be back in 1 minute. I'm going to try airing an ad and see how that works, because I don't actually know how that works. So I will be back in 1 minute. Okay, so that should be the end of my ad there. Sorry about that, folks. But my throat is killing me. I'm still getting over the tail end of the sickness here. All right. So now we get to the cards that I am going to call good. And by good, I mean in the decks that they are in, these cards are going to make a major difference. So over the course of my discussion, I decided to promote Destiny Spinner. We've already talked about that one. So next is Thassa's Oracle. All right. I know what you're thinking. This card's a merfolk, so it can't be good. And you're right. But we don't care about the creature. We care about its trigger. So there are a lot of decks, well, not a lot. There are a couple of fringe combo decks that try to win via comboing off and milling their entire deck. So when you do that, as of right now, Laboratory Maniac tends to be the win condition. Or sometimes they'll do something like a Lotless Giant instead. Thassa's Oracle lets you dodge some hate cards. So it doesn't matter if you kill this thing in response to its trigger. You still win the game. You don't magically get saved by something like a Veil of Summer from your opponent. Like, oh, nope, I have hexproof now. Haha, you didn't get me. So this is a card that is going to be kind of an upgrade to some of the kill conditions of these other decks that we've seen. So previously, like Lab Maniac, some sort of like Angel of Glory's Rise, Lotless Giant, or even the red creature, where it comes back, it deals damage based on the number of creatures in your graveyard, or its power, or something like that. Totally blanking on the name of it. A lot of those kill conditions had problems, whereas this one doesn't really have problems. You know, as long as your deck is empty, this one gets a kill as long as that trigger doesn't get, like, stifled or something like that. So while this card isn't widely playable, it is just going to be a strict upgrade in the couple of decks, such as Oops All Spells, that can play it. Farika. Alright, next up is Farika's Libation. And this is a cool card. So, at 3 mana, target opponent sacrifices a creature is not playable by Legacy standards. You know, a Diabolic Edict effect at 2 mana is fine. However, Black now has gained the ability to answer enchantments, and that's new. Wreckman Z, thank you very much for following. I hope you're enjoying the Legacy set review here. So, notably, in a deck such as Mono Black Reanimator, they haven't had an answer to Leyline of the Void in the past. So instead of answering a Leyline, they just decide to hardcast some Grave Titans with Lake of the Dead. This gives Mono Black Reanimator an answer to things like Leyline of the Void. And this is a very flexible card. It can deal with multiple different kinds of graveyard hate. So this is a card that answers Scavenging Ooze, Containment Priest, Leyline of the Void. That's a lot of things that sort of deck cares about, while also randomly just stopping any other, like, Hate Bear or Early Threat. So this card pretty good. Now, is it a little expensive? Yeah. Yeah, it is. So you hope your opponent isn't playing like things like Daze or Spell Pierce when you're playing against them. But this is definitely a card that is going to see play in Legacy sideboards. Will it see play in actual Red-Black Reanimator? I don't know. That gets to be a little bit harder, because Red-Black Reanimator is more about correctly identifying what graveyard hate your opponent is playing and adjusting accordingly. So, like, you just get, like, better fast options when you also have access to red. You know, you get shatter effects that let you deal with Grafdigger's Cage. You know, you get, you control a forest, so you get to blow up Enchantments card, Reverent Silence. So, like, you have fast options there. But if you're in limited colors, this is a great option. I also wouldn't be surprised to see this see some play from something like a Stryphopile deck, where you're okay with playing some slightly more expensive cards that have added utility because you have so many different overlapping but slightly different effects, and just having the option to answer an enchantment with a black card can be pretty important. You know, the Sylvan Library example from earlier was a great one, where if that thing just sits there all game, it gives your opponent a huge advantage. You know, if you're playing something against something like a Maverick deck, this is a great card. Like, oh, I got your Knight of the Reliquary with it, or I got your Sylvan Library with it. This is a pretty powerful card. Slightly expensive, but I think definitely playable. I have to remind myself what 2 the Slaughter is. That's the red one, right? Or is that the, like, black exile thing? Target player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker if there are 4 more cards. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, but this one hits enchantments. I definitely think, too, that Slaughter is a great, great card right now. This is a card that is going to let Grixis decks answer enchantments. I think that's a big deal. This is a really good card. And it's a common, which is also so surprising. You know, right now in the Oko-oriented world, sure, 2 the Slaughter sounds like an absolutely amazing card. But, you know, we're not always going to be there. So I think this is a card that you should not forget about in your deck building, because there are going to be times where this is going to be good. All right, we have one more card in the good category. I love Soul Guide Lantern. So, when this enters the battlefield, you exile 1 card from your opponent's graveyard. Then you have a Tormod's Crypt that gets to sit there. You also have the ability to cycle at endgame to draw a card. I love this card so much. Oftentimes, in a graveyard hate situation, exiling 1 card is very good, but not quite enough. So I want you to imagine you're playing against something like Hogak. Your opponent on turn 1 has put 1 critical card into their graveyard. You nab it with Soul Guide Lantern on the way in, and then it sits there until you have something else that you need to exile. Similarly, there's going to be situations against Reanimator where you get their first creature that they put into their graveyard with this card, and then you have Tormod's Crypt that gets to sit there afterward as well. So conceptually, I think of this card as something that is letting you, how do I say this? It's kind of letting you have 2-for-1 graveyard hate that's slightly situational. And sure, since it says each opponent's graveyard, it doesn't target, so it can get around some weird effects like Leyline of Sanctity. That's probably never going to happen. Additionally, this card just being able to cycle is really strong. So consider an Emery deck. That's a card I've brought up a couple of times tonight because it's great and on the top of my mind. So in an Emery deck, like, you can play this, nuke a card, exile your opponent's graveyard, recast this, and then start using it to draw cards later on in the game. This card, in my mind, is an absolute upgrade to Relic of Progenitus. In that Relic of Progenitus is kind of unplayable by Legacy standards because it costs 2 to nuke the graveyard for the first time. So when this card comes in, you get the card that you want out of the graveyard. When Relic comes in, you get a card out of your opponent's graveyard. You can also immediately crack this if you need to get all of your opponent's graveyard. This card is absolutely great, in my opinion. And I see a lot of people being pretty medium on this card. I think this card is incredibly powerful. I will be putting this into my Legacy sideboards. And if you have any artifact synergy, like Emery, like Painter, anything of that nature that is going to let you like redeploy this card again, it just becomes insane. All right. I have 2 more categories. I think we only have one archetype defining power level card in this set. And that's Underworld Breach. So I'm not going to just like totally go into the archetypes that this is going to enable, as other people have already written multiple topics on the issue. The general idea is that using Self-Mill and Brain Freeze, with this and Lion's Eye Diamond, you can just go off and kill your opponent instantly with this, relatively safely, assuming your graveyard is safe. A key difference between this and other similar cards that have been printed in the past is that this is an enchantment, and it says each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. So that means you can like play a Lion's Eye Diamond, crack it, play it from your graveyard. So this lets you do it like again and again and again and again. And that's pretty darn strong. I believe Bryant Cook has an article up about like this card and the implications on it for decks like TES or Ant, where like how does this compare to the other things that we already have. So I believe that you can build a new deck entirely around this card. However, I don't think that this card changes Legacy at all. And I don't think you change any cards that are in your decks because of this card. The Graveyard Hate and Storm Hate cards that you are already playing are going to be good against an Underworld Breach deck, in all likelihood. So, you're playing Null Rod. Well, guess what? Stopping Lion's Eye Diamond is going to be great against this card. You're playing a Leyline. Oh, well, that's going to be great against this card. You're playing a Surgical. You know, it's probably going to work out that that's going to be really, really good. You're playing a Canonist, a Deafening Silence, a Chalice. All the things that are already good against Storm and Reanimator are going to hit this. Yeah, hey, Yawgmoth's Will is a fine card that's legal in some formats. As a one of, you only get one Yogg's Will in Vintage, right? Yeah. So this card's power level is very clearly pushed. The card is great, but I don't know that the deck that plays this ends up being much faster or more consistent than the Legacy decks that we already have. And TES, Ant, and Reanimator all have like amazing champion pilots who have been working with the archetype for a long time. I don't know that the brewers who are going to take to trying to break this card will end up making something that's better than what we already have. So this card is probably the best card from the set in terms of like objective power level. This card is crazy good. It also may slot into like the mono red Storm deck that we already have, but I'm not super familiar with that deck, so like I don't want to speak too much to that. I don't think Underworld Breach is going to be bannable. I think the I think the card is very good, but like I just don't see it changing Legacy. the engine is going to be very graveyard reliant. And graveyard hate, at least if you're an online player, is something you're already like very, very cognizant of. So I don't know about this one. It's if there is a broken card from the set, it is this one. But I don't think this card is format defining. You know, in retrospect, you know, Karn the Great Creator, Dreadhorde Arcanist, you know, Oko. We've gotten a lot of those sorts of cards that would fit into this category recently. I don't think this one is quite there. So recapping, I think our power level of this set, hello, is lower than our power level of the last couple of sets. And I'm honestly pretty glad to see that. I think we only have a handful of cards that are like going to have a true impact on Legacy, but we're going to see a decent amount of options for some fringe decks and some things that people will probably go and get to try out. And those are sort of my thoughts on the format. PVDH on Twitter has a decent series of posts where he talks about many of these cards. But I decided to talk about more of the like bad and fringe playable like corner case scenario cards as well. All right, so now I open up questions to the chat. Is there anything that I missed? And is there anything that you want to talk about that I didn't already talk about? And Nathan, thank you very much for the donation, by the way. Very much appreciated. I'm getting over sickness now. Had a rough couple of weeks, but daily D&T is now back on track. I totally thought it was you who donated. All right, well, my bad then. Oh, no, it was Nathan S. You almost got credit for a donation that you didn't give. Whoops. Jerry, no, you are not. There are no D&T playable cards in this set unless you count Soul Guide Lantern as something that you may consider for a sideboard option. All right, there's a good question. You have a comment on why WotC seems to hate white in the last few sets. Consider the 2 years where we got Prelate, Recruiter, Palace Jailer all in a row. I think like Containment Priest was in there as well. Oh, that was one set. One set. Conspiracy. Yeah. So there was a little while where Death and Taxes got the largest relative boost of any Legacy deck in a single set, or even the course over like maybe a 2-year period. So the supplemental sets were extremely kind to white. We got incredibly pushed cards out of the supplemental sets. And actually a huge proportion of the D&T cards are from supplemental sets. Council's Judgment being another one of the ones as well. So I think that many of the cards that have come through Standard in recent years haven't been good, but there were times when the white cards in Standard were crazy good when I was playing. So I'm dating myself here in talking about this standard format, but like back when Snapcaster Mage was legal, like white was really darn good then, right? We had tools like Sphinx's Revelation, a whole bunch of good removal spells that we could like Snapcaster back. Prior to that, we had like the Stoneforge Mystic cycle in World Wake, the Squadron Hawks cycle after that. Like we had all the like Cawblade style decks in Standard. We had Mirror Crusader plus equipment in Standard. I think we are on the downswing of white being very strong. And I hope that pendulum swings back around. Because as a whole, the white cards have definitely been underpowered recently. But like back when I actually played standards, standard, I didn't think of white being less powerful. I thought of it as being more powerful. Is that the spider? Or I also have the Endless Web. Whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, make a 1/2 green spider with reach. Yeah, so I looked at that card, and my thought was, is this better than other green things that I can be doing at 4 mana? And the answer that I came up with was no. You know, at 4 mana, you have things like Questing Beast, Oracle of Moldiah. If you're in something like Nick Fit that's in multiple colors, isn't Marin at 4 mana as well? You know, if you're in red as well, you have things like Huntmaster of the Fells. And my thought was that like this isn't getting wide. How do I say this? This card isn't going wide enough, quickly enough to make it worth it in my mind. Yeah, Shifting Ceratops is another great example where like, do you want this like crazy aggressive pseudo reality smasher card, or do you want this spider? Yeah, so I think that's all I've got for this set review. We ended up going for about an hour and a half, and that's pretty good. My voice is shot for today, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I'm going to be back on Saturday with some Death and Taxes content. We're going to play a little bit on stream, and I think I'm going to play with some fun stuff. Lord Darkview wanted to see some Restoration Angels in play. It has been too long, so I think that's a good idea. Folks, I hope you all have a great night. Let's see if anyone's playing Legacy that I can host. Looks like Jarvis is online, so I'm going to go ahead and host Jarvis. Folks, I hope you all have a great night.